Okay, today we need to talk about simplifying fractions. And first we got to make sure we understand what equivalent or equal fractions are. In these three pictures, the first one says half the pizza is still in the pan. Half, we know the fraction 1/2 is 1 over 2, 1 out of 2. So 1 out of 2 equal sized pieces are in the pan. But in the second picture it says 2/4. Well, most of you know 2/4 represents the same as a half. 2/4 just means 2 out of 4 equal pieces or slices are in the pan. And 2/4, if you look at the picture, it represents the exact same piece. And if you take that a step further, you could think 4/8 of the pizza is still in the pan. 4 out of 8 is the same as a half. And in the three pictures, it represents the exact same thing. So those three fractions are equivalent fractions. Equivalent fractions are just equal fractions. Fractions that describe the same part of a whole amount. So equivalent and equal mean the same thing. So your job is to find two fractions that are equivalent to each fraction. So you can come up with any two as long as they are mathematically equivalent. We'll pause the video here and come back when you've got at least two equivalent fractions and maybe share them with a neighbor. So hopefully you've had time to come up with two equivalent fractions for each one and maybe check in with somebody. And there's an infinite amount of equivalent fractions. The first one, 5/15, some people would simplify that right away by dividing the top and the bottom by 5, and you would get 1/3 as an equivalent fraction. Some people I know will take 5/15 and I don't know if you want to consider it a lazy way, but it's a fast way. By throwing a 0 on the end of both the numerator and the denominator, all you've done is multiplied by 10, so 50/150 is an option. So there's lots of, like we said, an infinite amount. Those are just two. Big thing is make sure that your fractions are equivalent. 10/12, it could be 20/24. If I wanted to multiply this time the top and the bottom by 2, that'd be an option. Another option would be divide the top and the bottom by 2, and I could get 5/6. So those are both options for you. 14/20. Maybe you want to multiply the top and the bottom by 10. Well, that'll give you 140 out of 200. Or if you want to multiply the top and the bottom by 1,000, you get 1,400 out of 2,000. So again, there's an infinite amount. You have to find at least two that are equivalent for you. Simplest form. Simplest form, most of you know how to simplify fractions. Simplest form is when you take that fraction and you make the numbers as small as possible. So the numerator and the denominator will have nothing in common, no common factors other than 1. So simplifying is when you're making the numbers as small as possible. And that's by dividing. You're dividing the numerator and the denominator by the same thing to get as small as you can. So your job is to simplify all three of these. Pause the video, give it a shot. So when you simplified 6/8, most of you said that you're going to divide the top and the bottom, the numerator and the denominator by 2, and you get down to 3/4. And I can't divide 3 and 4 by the same thing other than 1, so I'm done. 9/12. Right away kids look for 2, but 2 doesn't work for the numerator, but 3 works for both the numerator and denominator. So 9/12, if I divide 9 by 3, I get 3, and if I divide 12 by 3, I get 4. 9/12, 6/8, and 3/4, those three fractions are all equivalent. The third one, 28/35, again, you got to think, what's a common factor? What's something I can divide both the top and the bottom by? 2 works on the top but not on the bottom. 5 works on the bottom but not on the top. But 7 will work for both. If I divide the top by 7, I get 4, and divide the bottom by 7, I get 5. And there's nothing in common for 4/5. 4 and 5, the only common factor is 1. So hopefully you were able to simplify those. All right, 7 divided by 7. Hopefully we all know that's 1. Another way to write 7 divided by 7 is the fraction 7/7. 7/7 we know turns into 1. But another way to write this, if I thought of 7/7, I could say, hey, I'm going to divide the top by 7 and the bottom by 7 to simplify, and I would get 1/1. So 7/7 is the same as 1/1, which we know is the same as 1. And the reason we're covering that, just to make sure, if we know 7 divided by 7 is 1, well then m divided by m is also 1. Or you could say m divided by m is the same as 1 over 1, because if I divide the top by m and divide the bottom by m divided by m is 1. So 1 over 1, which we know turns into 1. So just a quick review there, we're going to need that now, because when we simplify fractions that have variables in them, it requires a little more thinking. So what we want to do is look. On the top of this fraction and on the bottom, I see a y and a y. So I'm going to ignore the x. I know that y divided by y turns into 1 and 1. The x is still here on the bottom because there's nothing to simplify it with. So I have 1 on top, x times 1 on the bottom. I could simplify that more. I still have a 1 on top, but on the bottom, x times 1 is x. So this would be the simplest form, 1 over x, 1 divided by x. Once in a while, a student will say, well, isn't that the same as x? And it is not. Here's why. If you knew that x was, I don't know, 5, you'd say, oh, that's 1 over 5, 1/5. Well, that's definitely not the same as just plain old 5. A fifth of a pizza and 5 pizzas are two different things. So 1 over x, or 1 divided by x. Now, what do you do when it's all mixed up and we got numbers and letters? What I always tell people to do is break it into pieces. Look at the numbers first. The numbers are 3 and 12. I know 3/12 can be simplified into 1/4. So I'm going to cross out the 3 in the original problem, change that to a 1. I'm going to cross out the 12, change it into a 4. So now I have 1 times a times b squared on top, which is b times b. And on the bottom I have 4 times a times c. And if I look at this, I see an a and an a on the top and the bottom. A divided by a we know is 1, so those both turn into 1s. I've got b's on the top, c's on the bottom. Doesn't look like I can simplify anything else. So now to simplify the whole thing, I go across the top. 1 times b times b. Well, 1 times 1 is 1. B times b is b squared. So on top I have 1 times b squared, which is just plain old b squared. On the bottom I have 4 times 1 times c, which is 4 times c. 4 times c is 4c. This is the simplest form. That's my new answer. So your job is to try simplifying these three. Take your time. Remember, if there's different numbers and letters, break it into pieces. Pause the video, try all three of them. We'll come back and talk in a minute or two. Okay, so looking at the first one, I don't see any numbers to work with. So I'm going to look at the b's. I see a b on the top and a b on the bottom. B divided by b I know is 1 or 1 over 1. So the b's turn into 1s. I don't see anything else common in the numerator and denominator. So my new answer, 1 on top. On the bottom I have a times 1 times c. Well, I know a times 1 is just a, and I'm going to take that times c. That's my answer, 1 over ac. In the second one, numbers first, 2, 6. I know 2, 6 will simplify to 1/3. So I'm going to go into the problem, change 2 into 1 and 6 into 3. I see m on the top and m on the bottom. M divided by m is 1, or 1 over 1. And I've got an n in the numerator, nothing else to go with it. So if I go across the top, 1 times n. 1 times 1 is 1, and then 1 times n is just plain old n. On the bottom, I've got 3 times 1, which is 3. This is my answer. In the third one, numbers first, I've got 24/8, or 24 over 8. Well, I can divide both the top and the bottom by 8. 24 divided by 8 is 3, so I'm going to cross this out and make it a 3. 8 divided by 8 is 1. I'm going to cross it out and make it a 1. X squared on top and x on the bottom. X squared on top means x times x on top and x on the bottom. Well, I know one of the x's from the top and one of the x's from the bottom can cross out and turn into 1s, which leaves me with an x left over on the top. So what I'm going to do is change this x on the bottom to a 1, and I know from simplifying up here that I have 1 times x on top, which is just plain x. So that means I got rid of one of those two x's, so I'm still left with an x. I know y divided by y is 1, or 1 over 1. So if I go across the top, I have 3 times x times 1. Well, 3 times x is 3x, and 3x times 1 is still 3x. On the bottom, I have 1 times 1 times 1, which is 1. This can go one more step. 3x divided by 1 is just plain old 3x. And if you're questioning that, what if it just said 3 divided by 1? Well, 3 divided by 1 is 3. X divided by 1, just plain old x. So 3x divided by 1 is 3x. Anything divided by 1 is just that thing. So hopefully simplifying fractions will work for you today. Just remember, when there's numbers and letters involved, break it up into pieces. It'll go a lot more smoothly. All right, good luck.